right, welcome to Coding Your Careers. So I am joined by Dan. How you doing, Dan?
Hi, doing well.
All right, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Dan Maas. I'm currently a technical director at Roblox. I've been in the tech industry for roughly 17 years or so. I've worked at both small startups and now a larger tech company. Been in Silicon Valley for over a decade. Have a background originally in 3D animation, now more in coding and distributed systems, but having a great time and eager to speak with you about it.
So that is a long time to be in the industry. Wow, I am just in awe at that. If you don't mind, maybe like a little, just brief summary. What do you like? How would you describe your career trajectory?
It's pretty unique, I would say. I began my first segment more on the computer animation side of things. In fact, almost completely on the artistic side. And then as I got further into it, I got frustrated with the limitations of the tools and started just a little bit of coding, doing like plugins. A lot of the 3D animation systems had some kind of developer kit where you could add simple filters and things. So it
Tweak things.
exactly, yeah. And so it grew and grew from there. I was working on a project where I needed more control over how like images are combined together. So ended up writing a compositing framework, and then that grew into more of a 3D animation framework. And by the end of it, I built a pretty nice toolkit that helped out with my animation business, but gave me a lot of exposure on software development as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then that's like that turned into then a large because it sounds like you just basically made your own framework, and then from there, it's so you seem like you went into leadership after that point, or how did that transition happen?
Yeah. Okay. So what happened after that is I had completed a bunch of big animation projects, and I wanted to take a brief break. I went back to school. I actually went to business school. The reason was because I had spent time at some larger studios and started to notice that the human element and the management element is just as important as the technical and the artistic sides. Rather than digging more narrowly technically, I wanted to get a better understanding of the business and management side of things. So that was a fantastic eye-opening experience. And coming out of business school, one of my classmates convinced me to do a software startup with him, which eventually became Battle House Games. Um, and so we ran that together for a couple of years, had a great period of growth. We went through Y Combinator, the startup accelerator. That sort of plateaued, and then I ended up taking a more sort of conventional big tech route over the last couple of years.
Okay. Wow, that's quite the journey, right? So it sounds like you've had some experience then in every sort of aspect, right? So you've done the I like the code warrior, I create my own framework, I'm not quite
Mm-hmm.
satisfied with my tool, I gotta build on it,
Mm-hmm.
to I have my own startup, we're gonna create a great product, get to market, raise capital, and like now it's like Silicon Valley large tech company working in that sort of apparatus. That's a very varied
Yeah,
experience.
I feel very grateful that I've had exposure to, as you say, both like the small scale do everything side as well as the large scale contributing a small piece to a much larger machine side of things.
So one thing that I feel is a little bit neglected in a lot of the discussions. So, for example, a lot of people talk about getting into tech, right? So, should you take a boot camp in 2023? Those sort of YouTube videos, right? And but I feel like one demographic that gets left out is people who are self-taught and get started, and people who have done the boot camp. They got their first job, right? This is me like 6 years ago, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
got my first job. I finally talked my way into it. I'm officially a junior dev, yay! And then I'm sitting down. It's okay. A year. What do I do as far as your own improvement? Then did it come in waves? What languages did you work in? What frameworks did you work in initially? Like how did that
Sure.
evolve?
Maybe let's first start in more general terms
Sure.
about growing your career, and then we can go into more technical details. So, big picture, growing a technical career is about having more responsibility and more scope and more influence. And some of the ways you can do that are earning the trust of your peers, your manager, your company, so that you're given those opportunities to have bigger impact. And another big thing is successfully completing projects that have some kind of important strategic impact that reduce errors or increase revenue or change something positively that matters to the business. And as far as, well, okay, how do I go about that? My advice coming in at a junior level is try to get a better understanding of how things work. You might be assigned tickets or assigned a particular task, but you should have your eyes open looking at um, trying to better understand how things work and the whys and the hows. And an example, to just pick one example of what you might do, is look for opportunities to automate processes that are currently manual. Like at every company around the world still has a ton of manual processes that people
Sure.
just deal with day to day. And there's fantastic tools that aren't super complicated, things like Zapier, or now there's millions of chat GPT based tools that can help you set up automations. And that's something where a little bit of extracurricular effort can have a big positive impact on your team. Another one is to get into like monitoring and alerting. Lots of times you deploy software, but you don't have great observability on how it's doing, what the errors
Sure.
are, how users are using it. And now there's some pretty powerful and easy to use tools to get that data. And it's something that you can instrument and then help your team learn all about things. So it's digging deep and gaining a better understanding of what's going on.
I like the way you answered that because I think that there is this sort of, because initially my question was started to veer towards, I think what people assume is that, oh, I just need to learn more C sharp. I need to learn what delegates are, or I need to learn this other framework. The first thing you said to me was, get to know the business processes, get your relationship with your manager in order to where they can depend on you to do projects, understand business processes. So it isn't just a matter of opening up of the C Sharp for Dummies and just memorizing more. It sounds like you have to have a wide berth of skills that you had to get on the job.
Sure. You certainly have to master the technical basics, right? You have to know your testing system, your deployment system, the libraries you use. It goes without saying. But there is a diminishing returns to that, right? Okay, you come out of a boot camp with some basic understanding. You maybe put in some more time, 2-3 years, sharpening your skills. But you're going to reach a point where what matters most is not the next technical concept. What matters most is how can you put all those pieces together in a way that makes a difference to your company or your team or your product.
I think that has a lot to do then with the relationship you have with your company, with like management, being able to find those points where you could do good benefit for your company. Because it got me thinking, one of my first projects when I was a junior dev was helping HR automate their payroll system to like check to make sure they weren't doing errors. That was literally my first project, was instead of doing its manual Excel jujitsu thing that they were doing, they wanted to just basically put this sheet in and tell them like, hey, we paid the people correctly or we didn't. And I got it going, and then it saved them hundreds of hours. That's the kind of thing it seems to be like you're saying, being able to show clearly like, I saved the company this much money, or I saved them hours, like that sort of thing. So being able to quantify it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the ideal scenario, is you're able to work on some improvement that has clearly moves the needle on some important metric like money saved or revenue, time saved, employees' time, things like that. That's a dream scenario. Now, in reality, you hopefully get some opportunity to work on that. There will also be the day-to-day, keep the lights on tasks, go update that library, reformat that machine or whatever. And there's no getting away from that completely. Although I'd say in companies that have well-organized management and development paths, your manager ideally will be looking out for opportunities to expose you to these bigger, more important challenges. But if you aren't getting that from your manager, I encourage you to speak up, do your own research, because ultimately it does fall on the individual to take care of their own progression.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about process a bit more, because I feel that the experience of process is very different depending on the size of your company. In my own personal experience, I've seen everything from, I work at a very small company where process was, oh, we hit publish and it's in the, there it
Right.
is, it's published, versus a bigger company where it's like, there's this department does that and this department does that. So how would you like, because again, you have a broad array of experience. How would you describe process like across the different sizes or different
Mm.
industries in your opinion?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely see the same as you, where at smaller groups like startups, because there's fewer people, there's less bureaucracy, you're able to get things out the door faster. Also, usually you're not required to support like a legacy system or a legacy customer base. And so you're more like starting from a clean sheet. And I think it's great to get that experience because it's unbelievable how fast you can build things these days. If you think about the modern UI frameworks, modern backend frameworks, all of the abstract platform as a service. Oh, I need a managed database, boom. Or I need a global load balancer, boom. You can just bring all these things together and get it up and running and deliver it. And then as you get to the larger size, those other concerns come in of we have a very large customer base to support that's on some sort of legacy system. And even though you want to make improvements, you cannot ignore the needs of those legacy users. And so you spend more time developing like migration paths and compatibility layers. You definitely want to invest more in testing so that when you deploy a change, you can be sure that you haven't broken the workflows that anyone else is depending on. And then, of course, there's things come into the picture like regulatory compliance, like maybe there are
Mm.
privacy rules that, or data protection, security rules that apply to your service or your team. And you definitely need to take time to handle those needs. So the picture changes a bit. It does can get slower, but swinging a big heavy hammer, it takes longer to get there, but the impact can be much bigger when it lands.
Oh wow, that's a good analogy. So one of the things I do notice is that it can be very daunting. Is there any sort of tips you could have, especially so I always tell like boot camp graduates that probably their first job is at a small to medium sized company.
Mm-hmm.
It competing with Fang, it's very heated, right? So you're competing with graduates from like top universities with computer science degrees. Maybe a boot camp graduate does not have necessarily the same chops as they do, or you know what I'm saying. So they go somewhere small like Bob's Pizza. Do you see like perhaps then at smaller companies maybe there's a good opportunity to suggest changes to processes or like to say hey maybe we can do it this way or maybe do it that way and like promote yourself that way and improve, or what do you think about that?
Sure. So I have a couple of comments on what you said there. So absolutely, it's uh, ideal if you can build yourself a track record. Like a track record of impact is fantastic. And the longer your resume grows, the less important the stuff at the beginning as far as like education or early career. And it's fantastic if you can land impact and say, during my time at this company, I worked on system X, and as a direct result of my work, we were able to, save Y or grow by Z. That's fantastic. Another thing is to develop specialization in a certain area. The larger companies are generally looking for subject matter experts. And sure, coming out of school, you've got your people with CS degrees that have algorithms backgrounds or whatever. But later on, people get more specialized, and you might become like an expert in front end interaction design or databases or caching. And if you become known for your expertise or develop a specialization, that can be really attractive to employers because sometimes they are looking for a really narrow, deep set of skills. And if you're a match, you could be a great candidate for that. And one other thing I'll mention in terms of like applying to larger leading edge tech companies, I would say that like a boot camper is not necessarily at a disadvantage compared to like a traditional CS grad. And the reason I say this is, and I'm talking general trends I see in candidate selection across companies, is that while smaller companies and startups are looking for the jack of all trades and have varying approaches, for the larger tech companies, what they often do is they give you challenges that are not super difficult but need to be completed quickly and accurately. So, for example, I'm assuming people know about code, those types of
Yeah.
coding challenges. Don't focus so much on, ooh, can I get the red? Can I spend 2 hours and get like a top difficulty leak code red problem done? I would recommend spending much more time on those easy green and yellows, but be able to do them really quickly and without mistakes. I think that will take you further when it comes to the bigger companies.
That kind of dovetails then into sort of time management. So again, so the things that you should spend time on to get the greatest bang for your buck. So should junior developers be doing those like kind of coding problems, or it sounds like there's a lot to do, right? Processes.
Yeah, honestly, I'd recommend wait until you're actually applying for jobs to dig back into leak code. It's like an athletic skill where you develop it, you do your interviews, and then you go off season for a while. Um, although, so something I would recommend spending time on is trying to keep up with what's new in the industry. And one way to do that is to read tech blogs. There's some fantastic tech blogs on all sorts of topics. Another one is to watch videos from industry conferences. Like most tech conferences are pretty good about like posting slides and videos online. And so whatever your area of interest is, front end, back end, languages, databases, whatever, pay attention to what the leading edge presentations are saying, because that'll give you a clue as to where the industry is going. And it also can help you in your present role. Often people see things at a conference and they're like, oh, we could use that to solve a problem that we're having right now. And you can be the hero for introducing that.
Yeah, I've seen people do that. They actually, most tech conferences I've seen are on YouTube. They have the whole thing. They'll have entire talks
Mm-hmm.
with examples and everything right then and there. So that's great free resource for people to see like what the lady. But I guess on the other hand, though, is it can be a little bit daunting to try to keep track of everything new. Because I always, for example, like I always feel like every week is another like JavaScript front end framework.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
You have to pick your battles, right? Like I said, find out where your interests are and think about becoming a specialist in some area. Find the intersection of what's interesting to you and what the industry and the market want.
right, and to figure out like where those two things like collide for you.
Yeah.
That makes the most sense. So you hit upon another really good topic. I tell people that in boot camps, well, learning development, like specifically web development. That's tips like when I
Mm-hmm.
teach boot camp, like burn stack, mean stack, etc. But then I turn around and tell them like maybe in 2 or 3 years, like you're a UI UX expert, or maybe in a couple of years you're the database admin. Again, you don't have to give me a laundry list, but what are some of the different areas that you could specialize in aside from
Mm.
just the typical web development?
Interesting. Where to begin? An area that I'm personally very passionate about is distributed systems, managing large collections of services that talk to each other. And there's all sorts of interesting behaviors that happen when you're at really large scale. And you can learn about this reading sources like, for example, the Netflix tech blog. Netflix was very early in this area, and people there published some fantastic information about it. Another one is more like on the like data science ML side of things. That's becoming more bigger and more essential business function every day, especially now with the revolutionary like language models, AIs that are coming into the picture. And there's even different pieces to that. There's the sort of data science of actually doing analyses and coming up with models. But then there's the infrastructure underneath it, like data engineering, data infra, where you're managing the massive data warehouses and the ingestion pipelines and the inference systems that sort of feed the monster of this model. There's also mobile devices, right? For a while it was phones, and now it's like wearables, like watches, VR headsets. There's a lot of unique skills in adapting software to run well on a device that is running off a battery, has a lower spec CPU, might have intermittent network connectivity. There's a whole array of skills that you can develop in that area, and it's extremely needed in the industry.
And also, it sounds like it has a very different set of problems because I like when I do like web applications, for example, I tell my students we have a garbage collector and it works. I don't need to know
Mm-hmm.
what the algorithm is. It just does its thing, and we spend memory like a drunken sailor. But if you're like like if you do gaming, if you're like you do gaming, I'm sure the same with distributed systems. Like the challenge set with memory management is completely different.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you want to see the absolute cutting edge of client side software, the AAA game engines are really there. Like you said, like the people who are tuning and squeezing every last microsecond out of the garbage collector and carefully orchestrating parallel threads across dozens of CPUs and synchronizing with the GPU. That type of stuff tends to come out first in the cutting edge, like gaming applications, and then eventually it filters through to the rest of the industry.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because it's like I said, web development eventually will come to us. Like I said, once it's been automated and made nice, and we can just pop it in, and that's it. Eventually come to us. But if you want to do the bleeding edge stuff, then you're going to have to like really dig into that. That's what it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that you can find success anywhere along that spectrum. Of if you really want to dig deep into micro optimization and push the cutting edge, there's opportunities to do that, and there's also opportunities to be much more on like kind of the MBA side of things, of finding new business problems to solve where you don't even need the micro optimized software, you just need a
Yeah.
solution for an industry.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I think that is its own skill set, which when I first got into the industry, I had underestimated the skill of being able to talk technical to non-technical people,
Mm-hmm.
and who have a completely different set of needs and wants and desires
Right.
than, and being able to like navigate that. Could you speak to that for a little bit, like how to build that as a skill?
Yeah, because the concerns are totally different, right? The business person probably doesn't care which front end framework you pick, but they care a lot about like cost, quality, speed trade offs. And
Oh
you could
yeah.
sort of, like couch those in those terms of let's align expectations. What do you need? What are the key like what's the problem you're trying to solve? What is the thing we're optimizing for? What are the constraints? And you translate those into technical terms of, oh, we need to like process insurance claims within 24 hours or something. And then that translates into some kind of end to end latency constraint. Or, hey, I have regulators who insist that we meet requirements XYZW. We probably need to implement some kind of audit trail or database or test suite that can prove that you meet those compliance goals.
And being able to, I think it's also a skill to be able to translate back and forth, like when you're in a meeting
Mm-hmm.
with people who I use the term muggle sometimes in boot camps when I'm teaching, so being able to talk to just non-technical people and be able to translate that. How do you build that as a skill? You know what I'm saying? Like how does that, because again it's so easy to slip into Star Trek techno babble.
I'd say read materials from the other side of that world, right? If you're building software to support salespeople, get a book on sales. And maybe it's not as fun as reading your technical manual, but force yourself to get through it and see what the terminology is and what people value and care about in that world. Um,
You'll also be able to pick up their vocabulary too, and just generally how they speak about things.
mm-hmm.
Okay. How is like that as a skill? Then it sounds like that if you delve into that could be its own niche. I'm saying it looks like that could be its own specialization. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that's the real power is like when you multiply your technical skill plus your sort of communication and adaptability, it's more like the product of those two things that determines how effective you are. And so if you're weak on one of those sides, try to shore that up so that maybe you're at least like an average communicator and a fantastic tech person, or a fantastic communicator, maybe your tech is average. But either way, you can find success if you find the right role.
Would you say then gone are the days where we have you're great at tech, but your communications maybe not stellar, but people are just okay with that because you're great at tech? That's a stereotype at the very least. At least I had
Yeah,
decades ago.
that type of person certainly still exists and can go a certain way, but you are going to hit limits, right? If you're a poor communicator or not great at teamwork, you are going to hit a ceiling at some point that you're not going to get past until you develop those other skills.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. I like want to talk about the question, right? I always get from boot camp students that makes me like I don't know, never know how quite to answer it. What separates a junior from a senior dev? What is the magic sauce that makes someone like? Because it's the same person, right? Is it just time? Is it knowledge of I know C sharp? I know what pointers and mutexes are. Or like what is the thing that really separates the two?
So definitely not just time. A couple of things come to mind. One is autonomy. in that, like, how much hand holding do you need to get something done? Where the junior person is going to need someone more senior to stand over their shoulder and break down the task into step by step, and they can execute that recipe and get something done. Whereas the more senior person can be just given a more vague goal. Hey, we have to reduce our deployment failure rate, or hey, we have to be able to iterate on our UI design faster. And then they can go off on their own and figure that out, or they can break it down in a way that juniors can come in and help with the implementation. And that comes from experience. And I think a key element is pattern recognition. Things that you'll just pick up as you spend time in the industry of, hey, this is something we can build a test suite for, or this reminds me of the time we had a problem like updating libraries. And just as you gain experience, your toolkit of patterns grows and grows. And that's what gives you that ability to execute on those bigger, more ambiguous goals. And as you gain that power, your role will evolve and you'll be trusted with bigger and bigger scopes. So it's not just like reviewing a single pull request. It might be reviewing the design of a subsystem, or reviewing the entire architecture of how we deploy our product. So being able to contribute and have good impact at wider and wider scopes marks that progression.
So it sounds like then while you're on your way to being senior, I guess I would call it, you're building your toolbox. Like it's not just having the experience, it's being aware of the experience and what you're learning from it is what it sounds like.
Yeah, like the takeaways, I think a good practice is to do postmortems on your projects and on your deliveries. And some companies have processes for doing this, but even if they don't, taking note of what went well, what could have gone better, what is reusable, what can I apply the next time I have a challenge like this, just so you can keep sharpening your skills.
Is it so? I also want to ask this question just so I can make some of my former students calm down. I can also use it as evidence that this is true. Do you have to know everything to be a senior?
No, absolutely not. You don't have to know everything. And in fact, a key marker of maturity is recognizing the limits of your knowledge and being willing to, one, admit that, and two, know where to go for help to fill in the gaps. I'd much rather be working with someone who says, I'm not the expert on this thing, but actually I know someone who is, let's go talk to them, rather than somebody who kind of BS's their way to a bad solution.
I am, and you heard it here first. I'm going to play. Dan will play his clips for my students. I always tell them rule number one: never BS. Just say you don't know. Just say that I'm not sure about that. But to your point, though, like to know where to go in order to get the answer seems to be also pretty important.
Yeah, and there's plenty of tools that you can throw in your toolkit for that. It used to be just like Googling and Stack Overflow, and now there's lectures, self-teaching, all of the sort of chat GPT like AI tools, and then your own personal network in the industry. I think some people can be valuable even if their technical skill may not be superb, but if they have a very deep network and ability to connect people and find solutions, that can be a great positive thing.
So, in your experience, then, the tech treats itself like a community. Then, so people reach out to each other for help. That's a common thing.
Yeah. In Silicon Valley, companies come and go. People bounce around the industry, but the personal relationships last much longer than that. And I'd say get to know your teammates, because even if they go away, they may reappear in your life, or you may want to reach out to them, or vice versa, years down the road. That definitely happens.
That's amazing. Yeah, because I've gotten positions from people I was like a former coworker with, and then all of a sudden things change over the years. Just because you're where you're at now does not mean 3 years from now is where things are going to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. The one constant is change, right?
Exactly. All right. I've had it on record as senior, you do not have to know everything. What else do you think would differentiate someone from junior to a senior then?
Making fewer mistakes. And I want to be clear that it doesn't mean you have to be a perfect human being, right? Every person makes mistakes, but it's catching them earlier and coming up with automations and guardrails that stop those mistakes from having bad consequences. Like I think earlier in my career, I underappreciated the value of testing. I thought, oh, I just want to like get new features out really fast. Like we'll do tests later, whatever. And now, even on like personal projects, I do thorough test suites because I've come to understand I am very fallible, but and the investment in building thorough test suites it totally pays off because you catch your mistakes early and you actually end up being faster. You're a little slower at the beginning, but you can iterate faster in the end because you can make changes confidently and just try out new things and have the computer tell you whether or not something is broken instead of waiting for it to land in production and then a customer complains about it.
Let's talk a little bit about like real world operations. This is a good segue into it because I also wanted to give people sort of an idea of what their day to day looks like.
Mm.
Because again, different companies, it's very different. Like at a larger team,
Mm-hmm.
right? It sounds like things are divided up between different groups. People
Mm-hmm.
have different responsibilities. Do you find that in general, do people stay within their own little like world? This is your set of responsibilities. You stick with it, and that's your job, and that's Bob's job, or how does it flow?
Yeah, of course, it's going to vary company by company. Some places have like a vertical structure where there's like a product area or product feature, and there's a same group of people who deal with the front end and the back end for that particular feature. There's
Sure.
also like that horizontal structure where you have like a front end team, and then they talk to a different team that does back end, and then there's another team that does infrastructure. So typically, you're operating within your domain that has well-defined boundaries, right? There's some service that you are responsible for, or your team is responsible for, and there's metrics that judge whether you're doing a good job or need some work in that area. But I would say the more successful people and the people who get to those more senior levels do keep a lookout on what's going on upstream and downstream because often you need to globally optimize, right? You need to have a 30,000 foot view to see better ways of working. Now, of course, it's a challenge to have influence outside of your area, right? It's not going to fly to just go change
Swoop
another
in
team's
and
code. But the real skill is having that ability to influence and like advocate for change. And again, like this is going to vary by company. There's different styles, but being able to rally people around an idea for an improvement and get them on board and land it and demonstrate the impact, like that's a sign of someone who's really maturing and growing in their role.
so then it should be encouraged and for at the very least again depending on the company to keep an eye out on the other teams like what
Mm-hmm.
is our unit, not just like my like specific team, what is our unit actually doing, what are our
Yeah.
processes, how we're interacting with one another, and having to like think of ways to improve on it.
Yeah, exactly. And think about what are the top metrics. Again, varies by company, but often there's going to be like a key metric that we really care about, daily active users or revenue or uptime or whatever. And then you break that down in individual pieces of my team is responsible for this service that talks to this and is relied on by that. And so you can pretty clearly see or trace that relationship of if I make my service 30% better, that's going to move the uptime by 2% better. And that's why this work matters. So having that view, and ideally the company understands this and gives you that on a gold, on a silver platter. But if you don't have that kind of framework, I think it's important for you to at least build it internally.
And then what are some ways in which you can go about being an advocate for those sorts of things? Once you find
Mm.
something, let's say you're like, okay, cool. I found that if I tweak this by my service by 30%, we'll get 2% gain in
Mm-hmm.
something we care about. How do you go about advocating for that? Because I feel like, because to paint a bit of a picture, a lot of people who graduated from boot camps were from industries where advocacy is not a thing that they're used to doing.
Mm.
Right? Right, the power structure is way different. They're more likely to be told what to do and then they go do it. They're not used to
Mm-hmm.
advocating.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something encouraged?
Definitely, yes. Although you have to go about things tactfully and thoughtfully, right? And it's a communication skill. It's really actually a sales skill. You have to understand the psychology of the audience you're trying to influence, understand what they care about. Like, for example, Silicon Valley is a very data driven place, right? So if you think some new approach is better, you should have some data or some calculations to back up why it's better. There's other places where it's more vision driven of we don't care too much about the day-to-day fluctuations, but we care, are we advancing this product towards something that people are going to want and use 5 years down the line? And so you can pitch that angle of, hey, look, the industry is going in this direction. I think we should change our strategy a little bit to be more in line with that. And I can't give a one-size-fits-all answer because it really depends on what the values of your organization are and what the people you need to influence, like how they think and what they care about.
But it does sound like that communication skill we were talking about earlier comes back again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you need to be able to say that to people in a tactful,
yes, yeah,
organized way.
Exactly, and succinct. It's best if you have your one sentence summary or at most your elevator pitch. Once in a while, I see these design docs that are about great improvements, but they're like a dozen pages long, and you don't get to the finale like impact until the very end. And everyone's busy, right? They don't have time to read all 12 pages. If you find out how to package what you propose in a soundbite, but then have supporting materials at the ready if people say, okay, why justify that? I think that's one way to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. Again, like marketing and sales and just like personal branding never go away, no matter what industry you're in. You know what I'm saying? So I think, like I said, I try to also like to dispel some of this myth that like you're going to be sitting at a computer for 8 hours a day, like the Matrix, right, with your hood and like the music going on in the background. I spend a lot of my day talking to people.
Oh, absolutely, like that coordination time, for sure.
Let's talk about that for a little bit, because I also want to paint a picture and show the real day-to-day. Like, how much time is spent planning? Just straight up, just before you actually execute anything.
I'd say the higher up you go, the more the balance shifts from execution and coding and flow to that communicating, collaborating, synchronizing, planning. So you've got like individual contributors on a team, and I'm envious sometimes when I see their calendar schedules and it's coding block, stand up coding block, right? Whereas you look at the senior managers and directors, and it's sync with the legal team on this compliance requirement, or present to the C-levels about what our upcoming plan is, and then break down this new upcoming project.
And no coding block is in there really at all. Like,
yeah, you have to, if you want to keep those technical skills sharp, you do have to fight to carve out time for that. And fortunately, Silicon Valley does respect that. And really senior individual contributors, yes, much of their time will be taken up by coordination and planning, but I think people still respect that you're going to need to set aside time to do some technical work. And this actually calls back to what I said earlier about large companies valuing the ability to not necessarily do the most extremely complicated algorithmic work, but to do the routine work really fast and really accurately. I have an example of this from my own experience, where I was working on a testing tool, and as part of that, we needed to implement a graph search algorithm. It would have been like a leak code yellow, probably, of you have some nodes and some edges and you need to find the connected component or whatever. But I only had, I don't know, a 3 or 4 hour block like that entire week where I could possibly have time to work on this thing. And so I felt like I was doing a leak code challenge of gotta get it done, gotta do it. And it worked. Like, I was able to get it done, but I'm thinking like, wow, the clock was really ticking, and I'm glad I had the ability to do that thing, which is not fundamentally rocket science difficult, but there was a limited time bound to be able to do it in.
Right. You weren't necessarily, okay, I'm going to go on Stack Overflow, read someone's blog, look at examples, take them all and piece them together. It's no, I've got to do it.
And that's, I think, something that comes with having more experience and having that stuff in your head and all the pattern recognition. And of course, if you gave the task to a more junior person, you leave a lot more time, because understanding that they have to do that research and that understanding.
So that leads me into another question, because again, I feel like, people, they don't know the industry that well, right? They're getting started with it. There is a little bit of trepidation that, I'm going to make a mistake and that's going to be the end for me. That's going to be it. I seriously, I have students basically say, I let them know the story of when I dropped the database. I was a junior dev and they didn't have privileges, and I just was like, yeah, I'll just back up the database, drop it, and just redo all the tables, and the schema will be like correct. And I that made sense to me, and so I did it. And then we got calls. Why isn't our website up? And then I tell them that I had a job the next day, and but students usually gasp at me. What do you mean? And I say, you're going to make mistakes, and it is understood that's going to happen. On the
Yeah,
flips, yeah, go ahead.
that's a good part of Silicon Valley culture is the appreciation for failure. Like, kind of, failure is glorious as long as you learn from it. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, you can make a mistake, fine. The key thing is, do not make that same mistake again, right? You should learn from it, create automated processes, do whatever, so that you just don't repeat that that thing that happened.
But again, it's not earth shattering. Then, as long as you like take that lesson from it, then it's like the beat goes on.
There's that classic story about someone in the financial industry was at IBM, where they went to their boss. I made a mistake in that deal calculation. It's going to lose the company $15 million. And here's my letter of resignation. And the boss says, why are you resigning? We just spent $15 million giving you training.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
It's true though. That's just true.
Right.
So then, and companies then see you as someone they're cultivating an investment. Then, like they see it. This is all part of the process of your growth.
Yeah, I see, especially given the imbalance of supply and demand for software engineers. For a very long time, there's a lot more demand than there is supply. And so good engineers are precious, and maybe they're not perfect, but they're worth like investing in. And that's why you see companies working very hard to retain people who are contributing and learning.
All right. One super, this is the question. I've always wanted to know this because I felt like for me, my first developer job, I was able to take my teaching experience and mold it into, hey, I'd be great for helping you like teach technical stuff to non-technical people. So that was like my in. How can people take their previous experience and say, okay, cool, like maybe, because a lot of times what happens is that like you start a new career, right? And a lot of your previous experiences doesn't matter. What can set someone apart? What can say I actually can make an impact at your company despite the fact that I don't have a technical background, my resume is sparse?
Sure. Things like perseverance and a willingness to break through walls to overcome obstacles and learn and grow. Those are things that cross between industries. If you've demonstrated that you have that success oriented attitude and perseverance, maybe you're an athlete who went very far in athletics or a performer, those kind of attributes are directly relevant to doing well in the engineering world. And also the communication, right? Knowing how to connect with other people, especially if they don't share the same values or communication style as you. These are all things that definitely transfer and can boost you in a technical role.
What about GitHub portfolios? Because I always wonder about them, right? I've been part of the hiring process, not like I've hired someone necessarily, but I've been on the council of people like, hey, what do you think of this person? I've looked at GitHub portfolios when the person was a UI UX person, because that was their way of saying, hey, I can do these like very intuitive, pretty designs, visual. How we always tell junior devs to have a GitHub portfolio, put projects in it. How much weight do they actually have?
Again, I can't answer for the whole industry, right?
Correct.
Again, I can't speak for any current or former employer, but just my own personal impression is it. So the portfolio does something. I think it's especially good at filling gaps. If you did not graduate with a STEM degree, it's helpful to fill that gap because there's always going to be the question of, okay, how technical are you? Are you actually able to grok the concept of build flows and type checking and whatever? Can confirm that. Another aspect is if you've been a successful contributor to well-known open source projects, that I think is a plus. Like, sure, okay, you can do like an end-to-end portfolio project of here's my calendar app or whatever. But if you're like, hey, I was a contributor to Kafka or Kubernetes or React or something, and you have a list of like significant bugs that you fixed or features that you were able to work on, that's a big plus. In fact, I know that there's a lot of hiring where a lot of companies are like building the enterprise version of some open source thing, and they use that open source community as a hiring pool. And so the best way to get a
Yeah.
job there is to just be an active contributor and become known as a positive influence in that community.
Oh wow! So they literally that makes I never thought about it, but that makes perfect logical sense. Like we would like to build a bigger version of this, and you build the skateboard. So would you like to come build the bigger version?
Yeah, exactly. And there are dozens and dozens of companies right now that have that model where they're like the enterprise version of open source thing, or they heavily use a project. Like, for example, I can imagine if you wanted to get into video streaming, working on FFmpeg could be very productive because FFmpeg is a video library that is incorporated into so many different pipelines at so many different companies. Same thing with like security, right? If you work on OpenSSL or some of those like security related tools, there's like dozens of companies out there where those tools are a big part of their operations.
And so also that could be a great segue into, again, what we were talking about earlier. There's lots of different places to specialize, like security, like we just mentioned, or like video streaming. Even that, it might seem like a narrow niche, but actually, again, that's used everywhere.
Yeah, and there's so many aspects to this industry, and like I said, the demand vastly outstrips the supply, at least for now.
One last question I want to end on. And again, I don't expect you to have a crystal ball. This is purely your own opinion. Right now, a lot of people, they tend to worry about, if I'm learning this language X, will that be used 10 years from now? If I learn this framework Y, will that be used 10 years from now? They have some little bit of anxiety about where should they spend their effort on that's still going to give them value like 10 years from now. So what would you like for a person who's like in that position or has anxiety about that? What would you say to them?
It gets back to what I said about pattern recognition and seniority coming from having a bigger and bigger toolkit of common patterns that you see. And the way I'd apply this is you should definitely get exposure to a very high level language that has like a virtual machine and a garbage collector. Doesn't matter which one, right? It could be Java or Ruby or Python or whatever. You should also get exposure to something really low level with manual memory management and concurrency management, like C or Rust, or I guess Golang is in the middle. But it doesn't particularly matter which one of those things you pick. But having those patterns in your head are very long lasting, right? Java's been in production for probably like 30 years now. Oh. And even if it's not the hottest language today, those concepts are still transferable, right? You can go to a company that's using like Ruby or Python or Node.js or something. And aside from the superficial syntax, most of the concepts you've learned transfer over very well there.
So then you would say then that there's actually, apart from just the language itself, like obviously knowing syntax and maybe knowing the idiosyncrasies of a language is one thing. But for example, I always tell my students, once you understand what a request and the response of what an API's job actually is, it doesn't really matter that much if you do it in .NET versus if you do it with Node. Once I teach you one, you've really learned them all.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I never formally studied Golang. Don't tell anyone, but I'm contributing to Golang code bases because I've seen the same patterns over and over again, and I can map them easily into a new syntax, and then just keep in mind whatever small differences there end up being.
How do you like Golang, by the way? I'm using it right now, and I find it to be this lovely middle ground between a lot of different things.
You have to think of it in terms of use cases where it's a great fit and use cases where it's not as great a fit. For example, you probably wouldn't want to write a front end that deals with a lot of HTML in Golang, right? But if you're writing a network server, like you're writing a DNS server or something that deals with bits and bytes coming off the wire and needs a lot of concurrency, like it's a fantastic fit for that. And also thinking back to its origins at Google, it's designed to be harnessed by large teams of people who aren't necessarily global experts. So like it has the way it does like strong type enforcement, the way it has opinions on testing and code formatting and all that, makes it a really nice fit for large code bases worked on by a diverse group of people. So yeah, like for those sorts of use cases, fantastic. And I think there's projects that are doing great with it, but I also have like personal projects where it would be complete overkill and not the right fit. And I do a backend in Node.js or Python, and I lose some of the safety and strictness features, but I gain more in just being able to like whip out a page long, an HTTP server and like a page of Python code, and it does what I need fine. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So therefore, then a lot of people like try to pick their first language. Like again, your own personal opinion. A first language. If someone were just thinking to themselves now, what would you choose? What would you tell them invest their time in?
A couple of perspectives on that. I think there's one school of thought that's like JavaScript should be first because it's ubiquitous and it's very easy to make visual results with it, right? As opposed to starting with a lower level language where you have to learn so much just to get something printed to the console. And if you want any kind of user interface that's graphical, forget it. Right. Whereas like JavaScript lets you almost like short circuit to that. I'd say if you're really serious, my advice is think of categories of languages and pick one from each category. So like low level systems language, get some exposure to like C, C++, Rust, something in that area. You don't have to become an expert, but at least see what it's like and glance at like assembly language and machine code. And then have a higher level managed language. And I'm thinking things like Java, C Sharp, and Golang kind of fall in this category. And then another one would be like the really fast and loose scripting languages, where I'd say like Python is probably the leading one in that category. But it doesn't matter which one you pick, but just get exposure to the way things work at those different levels of abstraction and how they fit or do not fit certain use cases.
All right, so getting a feel for how the flow, because I like to take my C Sharp students and eventually learn JavaScript, and they have a little bit of a culture shock.
Oh yeah, like a culture in terms of the communities are so different, right? The typical library in like the Golang world has got a thorough test suite and like they close bugs quickly and care about this. Whereas like the typical library in the JavaScript world is like, oh, I just threw this thing together and oh, it actually doesn't install because it depends on this version of that thing. It is not compatible with this version of that thing and whatever.
Good luck. Good luck in like trying to work with it.
But you look at the statistics and the world is built on JavaScript.
Yeah, that amazes me every day. This is just how much it's like how ubiquitous it is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think I like the idea of at least being familiar with like maybe one of each different category like over the course, and just maybe you have to be the world's like leading expert in every idiosyncrasy, but there's different flows, there's different workflows, there's different feels to them, there's different use cases.
Yes. Yeah. And it's like really neat to see how things become easy or hard depending on the language you're using, right? Like you're writing and you do it in like JavaScript and React, and it's natural and easy, whereas you try to do it in like C++ with Qt or GTK or something like that. You're like, ooh, this is rough. Whereas if you're writing like math code that needs to multiply matrices really fast, your higher level language just isn't going to keep up with hand-tuned low-level code.
And that is a consideration that you have to take into account, especially like things like machine learning. Like that's like the new latest thing, or gaming and things like that. That really matters.
Yeah, although very often there's like a two-level structure, like for data science and machine learning, right? Python is the standard language, but all of the math routines and heavy lifting are implemented in like highly optimized low-level libraries. So Python is just like a traffic cop that sets things up and then presses go, and then the GPU like fires up and does everything independently. And same thing for game engines, where usually there's a core in C++, but then there's a lighter weight scripting language like Lua that is used to do like unit AI and game balance data and that sort of thing. Just because it's just not a fit to try to tackle everything using one language or one like set of concepts. You have to build a stack of like low, mid, high level
to actually like to fulfill the requirements and to do what you would like to do. Mm-hmm. So then I guess you would say then it would be normal for someone during the course of their career to learn multiple languages, to move between them.
I think the most effective engineers who are going to go the furthest, maybe you specialize at one layer of abstraction, but you've got to know what's going on above you and below you to be the most effective.
So that goes back to keeping your eye on, maybe not keeping your eye on other teams, seeing what they're doing. Like maybe there is, there again, depends on the industry, but maybe there is like a chance to see like what the PHP people are doing or the C++ people are doing,
Yeah.
and learn from it.
Yeah, have lunch with them and talk to them about what are the biggest challenges you're facing, what are the most powerful solutions you have, and I'm sure you can learn something from a chat like that.
All right, we're coming up on time, but this has been absolutely fascinating conversation. Again, I hope that people who are already in the industry but are thinking like, what do I do now? Like they're at their desk, what do I do? I hope this has been really helpful. There's been a lot of really good advice. I think it's come out of this conversation.
Sure. I hope it's been helpful. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
All right, thank you. And this has been Coding Your Career.